from Kansas State University. This is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And ahead today, an extended conversation with K-State's Guy Allen on the U.S. corn export outlook. He'll analyze the numbers from the USDA's latest World Corn Supply and Demand report released last Friday. And Guy zeroes in on the corn trade opportunities with China moving forward in the wake of those two huge Chinese purchases of U.S. corn in recent days. And he'll comment on whether the political tensions between the two countries will affect future grain business with China. Guy's along with us next. Also, following today's agricultural news headlines, K-State's Gus Vanderhoeven checks in with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas. All that coming your way here on Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
You're listening to the midweek edition of Agriculture Today on the K-State Radio Network. Thanks for joining us. We'll devote the first half of today's program to the international grain trade scene and our prospects for corn sales to various customers around the globe, and we'll focus in eventually on one in particular. That would be the big one, China. Joining us once again from the IGP Institute here at K-State, the senior economist with the Institute, Guy Allen. To remind you, prior to coming to K-State to take on that role, Guy logged extensive time in the commercial grain trade business on behalf of U.S. interests based for a long while in Australia, but having spent 3 years in that undertaking as well in China. And he's with us today to talk over some things that, Guy, you and colleague Dan O'Brien of K-State Research and Extension shared earlier this week in a meeting with the U.S. Grains Council, a presentation on the state of affairs regarding grain trade, and you are pulling from that USDA World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates report from last Friday. What was your general thought as to those numbers and what they said, particularly on corn?
Thank you, Eric. Yes, the WASDE report was out on Friday, and within that was the international markets and trade outlook. And just to touch base initially on the world corn balance sheet, even though the numbers were down for July from the June numbers, they were down about 25 million metric tons. We're still seeing record production of corn in the world this coming marketing year. 1,163,000,000 metric tons, which is a lot of corn. And that's going to have to find a home and usage. Now, the good news is we're also looking at record demand within those numbers. Record demand we're looking at is about 1,154,000,000 metric tons of demand around the world. And that's being underpinned by strong demand, particularly from the livestock and feed sector. We've seen a good recovery, reasonable recovery in the ethanol and energy sector here in the U.S., which is very important to our domestic situation. But the big driver we'll see around internationally as we go through these numbers is coming from that feed sector. Just to come down to the bottom line, we're expecting to see ending stocks down slightly on the month, but up slightly year to year. And it's that ending stocks number that the market tends to look at. But I think that ending stocks number is very uncertain at this point in time, and we'll talk about that. Changes in production around the world. The big one is the United States. As we're covering from last year's production due to wet weather, we're seeing an increase of about 35 million metric tons in corn. We're seeing modest increases of 6 million metric tons in Brazil. And also the Ukraine's coming up by about 1 million metric tons, which is quite important as they continue to grow their export situation there as well.
What about the other side of the production scale then, where the output might be to the lower side?
Some trouble spots around the world. We're seeing Chinese corn production down about 700,000 metric tons, and South Africa struggling with dry weather. We're going to see a drop there about 2.2 million metric tons in corn production, which is, I think, going to provide some limited opportunities of exports into to Africa particularly. As I said, consumption, we're looking at a record number. While it's off 3 million metric tons from last month, we're up 3.5 million metric tons from last year, again being driven by the livestock sector. Of that number, 728 million metric tons is going to be feed. And the biggest consumer of that is China, which over a quarter, or about 26% of that feed demand, is coming from China. And we'll talk about that a bit as they recover from their African swine fever situation and see significant growth across a number of the species types.
When we talk of feed, though, broadly beyond just China, is it in the form of corn or in the form of DDGs, or is it a mix? What?
Well, we put together the whole feed complex. Corn dominates that. I think corn makes up about two-thirds of the total feed complex, and everything is priced relative to corn. The interesting thing is if you put both China and the U.S. together, you have well over about 60% of world corn production sits in these two countries, just over half. So it's quite a big chunk of corn that we're looking at, and they're also the two biggest consumers. The U.S. is about a fifth the world consumption of corn in the feed sector, followed in by the EU, which drops down to about 9%. Throw in there Brazil and Mexico, which are also big consumers of feed grains as well, particularly as they export meat products, whether it's in the form of beef or dairy there as well.
There's something else that clearly needs to be accounted for here, the movement of corn in the trade into the biofuels channels. That would be a factor to be weighed as well.
Yeah. Just to comment on the food, seed, and industrial sector, the predominance of that being ethanol. The demand for that is expected to reach a record, even with the problems that we've had in 2020. We're recovering from that. We expect to consume about 426 million metric tons of corn into the food, seed, and industrial sector. The U.S. makes up about 40% of that, again, driven predominantly by the ethanol situation.
Then when we work our way around to the corn stocks numbers, which the trade always likes to talk about, what do those numbers tell us?
Turning to ending stocks, which is always what we're trying to figure out how much we're going to have left at the end of the year. After 4 years of modest decline in ending stocks, we're going to see a slight increase. We expect ending stocks to be up at the end of the year by about only 3 million metric tons, but very easily we could see the demand situation develop such that we continue to see a decline in those ending stocks. Keep in mind, over 60% of those ending stocks are held in China. Generally, the market looks at the ending stocks excluding China. Those stocks would not be accessible to the marketplace if we wanted to go get them. So we generally look at the world situation excluding China, and there's always a big question mark sitting over those ending stock numbers.
So when we get down to actual U.S. positioning in this market as far as exports, what are the numbers suggesting? Again, not just to one country, but across the spectrum here.
Yeah, last month I was actually fairly bearish or neutral to the marketplace. There's a lot of corn around the world, and the U.S. was going to have to compete pretty hard for that. With the modest drop in our production and the continuing increase in world demand, you've got to be cautiously optimistic, and some recent events that have happened the last couple of days, I guess, has made me actually call me a small bull, as I think we're seeing some demand. Some of it expected demand coming into the market, but I remain optimistic it's probably going to be a bit bigger than what we anticipate with China.
And we'll talk about that in more detail. How about our competitors on that stage, though?
Yeah, look, the two countries I wanted to focus on would be Brazil and the Ukraine. Brazil, last year we saw Brazilian imports of corn come into the U.S., into the East Coast, particularly in the wake of the higher prices with wet weather. They're going to have more exports this year than last year. Brazilian exports are expected to reach a record 182 million metric tons. which is down from last month, but up about 11 million metric tons from last year. Now, that makes it quite difficult to compete into Latin America. That corn moves into places in Mexico from time to time, and it's going to have to find a home. And I think we're going to see in China buy a bit of Brazilian corn there as well. So we keep an eye on that South American crop. They should be finishing up their exports for the current year about the time we start ours, particularly Brazil. So it's something we're going to have to watch and be quite cognizant of. The other area is the Black Sea. And look, for wheat markets particularly, Black Sea's cheapest world wheat. Increasingly have to struggle with that. They're increasing their corn production. Exports for the Black Sea area are expected to increase this year by about 1 million metric tons, and it's going to be into that Southeast Asia, Middle East area of the world there as well.
So that gives us a broad brush idea of what's happening with the corn market around the globe where the U.S. might fit in. And we will spend a few moments after the break looking at that big player out there, the China market. But how would you characterize the scene overall, again, based on the WSDA numbers, Guy?
We've got a lot of corn to work through this year. As I said, we've got record supply. We also have record demand, so the trade's going to be quite busy. I think the U.S. is well positioned at the moment from a price point of view. We're quite competitive with the South American crop at the moment, particularly given international freight rates. And the Black Sea is very well priced, fairly expensive at this point in time. So from a price point of view, at the moment, we're quite competitive. So that sort of says, well, I think we've sort of put in a bottom or a downside to the market, and we'll just see how optimistic and how much upside we can claw away over this coming marketing year.
Well, lending to that optimism, as you've hinted a couple of times, recent business with China. And we'll get into that and talk about the prospects near term and longer term in marketing corn into that market after we take these moments away. Guy Allen is with us. He's the senior economist with the IGP Institute here at Kansas State University. They're sharing some thoughts that he and K-State's Dan O'Brien passed along in a presentation to the U.S. Grains Council earlier this week. We'll be back with Guy to take on the China subject next on Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Agriculture Today continues on the K-State Radio Network, and continuing our chat with our guest from the IGP Institute here at Kansas State. Guy Allen is the senior economist there, and we've been talking about the corn trade outlook as per the latest USDA WSDA report, but want to dig a little deeper into one of the primary market outlets for U.S. grains, and in our case today, corn, and that would be China. A profile of the corn marketing prospects there during this segment. Guy, if we might, this is predicated by a big sale to China a couple of days back, which resonated well throughout the market.
Yes, it was good to end last week on a very positive note as China was reported to buy 1.45 million metric tons of corn late last week, and that got us all fairly optimistic. Then Tuesday morning, I wake up to the USDA export report saying China has bought a record 1.76 million metric tons. So China's definitely been in the market. We haven't seen a lot of support in the flat price on corn, and I can expand on that later. But just a confirmation of those sales is good news and definitely putting a very strong floor in the demand. I think it's alleviating some concerns that China might not live up to their commitments for the Phase 1 trade deal, and it's just helping the market sentiment all the way around. And that 1.76 million metric tons of corn was the largest China sale historically. It comes in at number 4 historically on the all-time record. Number 1, just to put it into perspective, we have to go back to 1991 when the Russians came in on a day and bought 3.7 million metric tons of corn. Number 2 comes in again, the Russians, at 2 million metric tons back in 1989. There was an unknown sale back in 1979 of 1.86 million metric tons, and then China comes in 4th all-time at 1.76, just Tuesday's sale to the Chinese.
Well, let's talk of the catalyst behind this large purchase of corn by China. And this gets back to some of your earlier comments about what the Chinese are needing. It's all about feed demand.
Yes. China has seen significant growth in the consumption of animal protein products, particularly pork. 60% of the world's pigs sit in China, and they relate the price of pork with the consumer price index. And I'd have to say the correlation between the price of pork in China and that consumer price index is pretty much the same graph. So the Chinese government watches that cost of food quite closely, and we've seen escalating food costs in China in the wake of this African swine fever nearly 2 years ago, as it's just devastating their pork production. Now, the recovery of that pork production is a big question mark. The Chinese government continues to be fairly optimistic, and suggestions that they're well over 70% recovery at the moment. They got down to half the number of their peak number. We've recovered to about 70%. Some people are suggesting 80% by the end of the year. I had always been quite pessimistic of that number. However, I think I'm being proved wrong on that and changing my market sentiment. And that's supported, one, by their soybean imports along with their corn imports and their meal consumption, because that's what you make livestock feed out of in China, the same as in the U.S. It's corn and soybean meal. And just to put China corn production in perspective, they're the second largest corn producer in the world, producing about 260 million metric tons of corn. So you put the U.S. and China together, that's over half of world corn production, approaching 60% annually. But they are expected to consume about 277 million metric tons this coming marketing year.
Now, Guy, you mentioned that the driver here is largely their need for feedstuffs for the swine industry there. But other livestock are involved in that consumption as well, you say, to a lesser extent?
Definitely. We've seen growth. Look, the main consumption in China is pork, but followed very closely by poultry, and I'll put that both down as layer meat type birds as well as eggs. And they have a fairly significant aquaculture sector as well. And with the increased price of pork and the decline in pig numbers, a lot of the consumers over there have been moving to the other animal proteins, poultry, aquaculture, dairy, and we also have seen significant imports of beef from the U.S. as well as other producing countries around the world. So that's what's lending quite a bit of support to the livestock sector in the U.S. in recent months.
Well, this raises the hopeful question about how much more U.S. corn the Chinese might be in the market for here for the balance of this year. Does this recent sale lend any perspective to that? Yeah,
look, the USDA number has basically this current year is at about 7 million metric tons, which their tariff quota is 7.2. They've had that number plugged in for this coming year of 7.2. But looking at current price relationships, the price of corn in China is significantly above that tariff quota number to the point where we should see free market corn moving in there quite aggressively. Being a bit of an economic rationalist and learning to have trust in the markets and their efficiency over the last 30 years, I would be so bold as to say that China imports for this coming marketing year will probably be closer to 20 million metric tons than 10 million metric tons. I've become increasingly optimistic on that, coming from a very pessimistic position to start with. So I wouldn't be surprised to see 20 million tons of Chinese corn imports for 2020-21 marketing year.
Have to ask you then to relate that to price. You mentioned the flat price of corn.
Yes. Look, we haven't seen a response from the price market. To get to the pointed answer, I'd say, look, it definitely echoes corn prices well above $4, maybe approaching $4.50 if my crystal ball is clear. And look, the Chinese are very sophisticated buyers of corn. They price their corn basis futures and then manage their own foreign exchange situation. So the sales that have been reported, they're more than likely, I would suggest, probably basis sales. And the Chinese have either priced their futures in the last few weeks or have yet to price them as we move forward. And that's why we haven't necessarily seen a big jump in Chicago corn prices in the wake of this news. That information is probably already in the marketplace, particularly on the cash side of things.
Mm-hmm. I have to bring in here, and we're focusing on corn, obviously, but other grains that might move from the U.S. into China. Wheat is, of course, direct interest here in this area. Any introspect on that?
The feed grain sector directly relates to soybeans and soybean purchases, and that, I think, will follow. We haven't seen a lot of soybean purchases yet, but I think that will be forthcoming. Again, very much supported by that livestock sector. Was quite happy to see some hard red winter wheat and some spring wheat purchases along with those corn purchases. China is very much a food deficit country, and particularly as they continue to raise their standard of living for 1.4 billion people, that's a lot of potential demand there. Probably the most optimistic import side of things that I see is in the meat side of things. You know, when you import a pound of meat, a pound of beef, a pound of pork, a pound of poultry, effectively that's a corn and soybean equivalent. You know, I've got to remain quite optimistic that whole livestock sector, whether it's beef, pork, poultry, for a number of years going forward, based on the premise that we're going to see China there to continually buy meat products.
All of this is enthusing in the interest of the U.S. agricultural producer, but want to finish up on this and come back to something that's been touched upon, and that is the political give and take between China and the United States, the wrangling that's been going on, and whether that could possibly be an impediment to the prospects for corn trade or wheat trade or meat trade into that country. You seem to think that when it's all said and done, economics will win the day?
Yeah, look, the Chinese are very shrewd marketing people, and they're quite sophisticated in their marketing purchasing. I don't think they're going to let politics get in the way. I think we need to keep in mind a lot of the rhetoric is probably driven by, one, we're in an election season here in the U.S. There's a number of global paradigms that are changing and that are increasing a lot of discussions on a number of geopolitical fronts. That's a whole nother discussion we can have some other time, Eric, on that. But I don't think that we're going to let those disagreements get in the way of the trade situation. The U.S. is China's biggest trading partner. They need us in a big way. And I think going back, looking at where those record biggest corn purchases came from, the Soviet Union 20, 30 years ago, I think we learned a very hard lesson in 1979, 1980 with a grain embargo that the U.S. placed on Russia. I don't think we will go back to those type of situations. That's just not going to happen. I don't think any political party or bureaucrat's going to be advocating those sort of moves today or in the future to compromise our trading relationships.
Well, Guy contributes regularly to the agmanager.info website on matters pertaining to the grain markets from the international vantage point. By all means, check out his writings there, agmanager.info. Guy, it's always a pleasure to have you mic side. Thanks for coming over and passing all of this along to us today.
Thank you, Eric.
He's the senior economist with the IGP Institute here at K-State. Guy Allen. We'll be back with more after this break. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you. And on we go now to today's lead stories in agricultural news, courtesy in part of DTN. And to complement our discussion with K-State's Guy Allen a few moments ago, new information on Chinese imports of U.S. goods. Those rose for the first time since the coronavirus emerged earlier this year. China's appetite for meat and other agricultural goods helped Chinese imports of U.S. goods to jump by over 11% in June from the year earlier, after a 13.5% drop in the month of May. That's data from Beijing's General Administration of Customs. The Chinese buying helped to narrow the U.S. trade deficit with Beijing from a year earlier, though Chinese exports to the U.S. also improved, rising 1.5% in June from the year earlier after a 1% decline in May. In the first 6 months of 2020, China has imported 2.1 million metric tons of pork, 1 million metric tons of beef, and 45 million metric tons of soybeans from its trading partners. That represents increases of 140%, 43%, and 18%, respectively, from the same period a year earlier. Beijing's overall trade surplus fell to $46 billion last month. That was much smaller than May's $63 billion figure, and economists' expectations were for a $59 billion surplus. Lawmakers and others continue calling on the USDA to broaden both its programs for farmers and food aid meant to respond to the pandemic after a total of $16 billion set aside for the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, or CFAP. The USDA so far has paid $5.8 billion directly to farmers and livestock producers. The USDA has also spent another $2.7 billion to get food aid boxes to food banks around the country. Lawmakers and others are raising questions about how USDA determines who gets that aid and are asking the USDA to make changes to both programs. Representatives Shelley Pingree, a Democrat from Maine, and Jeff Fortenberry, a Republican from Nebraska, wrote a bipartisan letter on Monday to USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue asking the department to open up CFAP and to have that aid include more small, diversified farms that may sell direct to consumers or through other local markets. The Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economy Security Act, or CARES Act, had $9.5 billion for farmers and livestock producers. Congress included language so the USDA would include smaller operations which sell locally to farmers markets, restaurants, or institutions such as schools. Now, Pingree and Fortenberry are saying that despite this, the USDA did not provide any specific accommodation for those producers in the design of the CFAP payments. The program's rules have meant that many of those farms are struggling to access relief or are entirely ineligible for assistance through that program. As of Monday, the USDA reported $5.8 billion in payments have been sent out. Over 409,000 farmers and livestock producers have had their applications approved. The breakdown shows that cattle, dairy, corn, hogs, soybean, and cotton combined for about 96% of the total payments. Another 59 crops and livestock listed as eligible for payments account for about 4% of the total. And last Thursday, the USDA expanded the list of commodities that would be eligible for CFAP, including more than 40 different fruits, vegetables, and spices. Pingree and Fortenberry want the USDA to provide payments to producers selling locally by considering total revenue loss rather than price losses for individual commodities. They also want more flexibility in documentation for losses, and they call on the USDA to extend the eligibility of more commodities as well. The USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service has initiated the first purchase of vaccine for the National Animal Vaccine and Veterinary Countermeasures Bank. Scarlett Higgins tells us here that this new bank was created in the 2018 Farm Bill at the request of the livestock industry.
The Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service will invest $27.1 million in foot and mouth disease vaccines, which the agency would use in the event of an outbreak to protect animals and help stop the spread of disease. Vaccination helps control the spread of infection by reducing the amount of virus shed by animals and by controlling clinical signs of illness. While an outbreak temporarily would disrupt international markets, vaccination would allow animals to move through domestic production channels. The new vaccine bank is one component of a three-part program established by the 2018 Farm Bill to comprehensively support animal disease prevention and management. The U.S.-only bank makes a much larger number of vaccine doses available than what currently is in the North American Foot and Mouth Disease Vaccine Bank. The Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service will continue to participate in this program. However, the new bank will add to the nation's level of protection against this devastating disease. In the event of an outbreak, animal health officials would decide when, where, and how to use the available vaccine based on the circumstances of the outbreak. I'm Scarlett Hagans.
And the plaintiffs in one of several lawsuits challenging the Navigable Waters Protection Rule have asked a federal court to vacate the rule. In a motion for summary judgment filed at the end of last week, the South Carolina Coastal Conservation League alleges that the EPA's new rule is arbitrary, capricious, and unlawful. As that motion reads, they've asked the U.S. District Court for the District of South Carolina to throw it out. Agriculture, petroleum, and other interest groups have intervened in that case. Those include the American Farm Bureau, American Petroleum Institute, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, National Corn Growers Association, and National Pork Producers Council, among others. The rule was published in the Federal Register on April the 21st. It is alleged by the groups to have the effect of dramatically reducing the universe of waters protected, as they say it, by the Clean Water Act. The motion argues the agencies did not apply their scientific expertise in creating the new rule. Now, another lawsuit challenging that new rule is pending in the U.S. District Court for the District of New Mexico. The New Mexico Cattlemen's Association alleges in that suit that the new rule still leaves farmers and ranchers exposed to regulation of private property. The lawsuit filed by the New Mexico Cattlemen's Association alleges that both the 1986 regulation and the new rule illegally regulate non-navigable ponds, wetlands, and tributaries. That's a glance at today's top stories from the agricultural news page. You're listening to Agriculture Today. And coming your way next after our final break, our weekly fare from Gus Vanderhoeven on another aspect of life in rural Kansas. He'll be with us next. This is the K-State Radio Network.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so stay a minimum of 6 feet away from others and stay home if you can. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen.
I had hired Terry to make the creek crossing possible again.
That's Gus Vanderhoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
They were going to trim and remove the overhanging trees so the swatter could get through. We needed to cut the brome field, which is situated at the end of the dead-end road. As I passed the farmhouse turnoff, I immediately could see that no tree work had been done. Promises made. It's the easiest way to make someone happy. I even wrote a thank you letter expecting the work to be done, as promised. As I drove slowly on, negotiating the holes and branches, I wondered about the hay needing to be cut. I'd hired Terry to make the creek crossing possible again. I'd asked him to do that just in case. It's a steep crossing, steep and deep. The last time I mentioned it, Eric remembered how they had such a crossing to reach the extra 5 acres on their farm. It was even worse, graded on a slant. To cross it safely, you had to play with the brakes, just for 5 acres of wheat. I can imagine and feel the hesitation when approaching and then dipping down on a slant to get across. It's a feeling which stays with you the rest of your life. It's the same Cameron feels when rolling the big equipment onto the small bridge to our fields at the end of Galileo Road. I crossed the bridge, staying to the center, and glanced through the trees to the hay meadows. I saw movement of machines. They cut it. When I pulled through the gate and drove onto the field, I stayed clear of the swerving tractor and baler. They were picking up the very last hay. Trenton and small Shane stood to the side with the folded hay rake, ready to get onto the road to the next field. They are John Deere farmers, although their hay equipment has some different colors, but the baler is green. As Cameron made some field notes, I walked up. Climbing down, he said, "Done. All done." They had rolled up the brome and the prairie hay. That whole corner was done. The swatter was gone. They had used the crossing Terry had fixed. They knew they could not and should not wait any longer. I'm glad I had Terry work on the crossing, but I was disgusted and disappointed with the county. I have to have a chat with the appraiser. How do you value land for tax purposes you cannot get at because the county doesn't fix the road? It's interesting. But back to work at hand. While Cameron and I briefly talked, I watched Shane walk over. He's a 4-year-old farmer with a fitting John Deere cap. Trenton, who operated the hay rake, held him close while Cameron finished up. I too watched him closely as I circled. 4-year-olds can be impulsive, but 4-year-old farmers are different. Shane takes himself serious. He's Cameron's son, and I see him with his dad all the time, working. He has his seat on the tractor safely in the cab. As Cameron had stepped out, Shane ambled over, carrying a small backpack. I watched him climbing up the big tractor. He barely could take the steps up. I noticed a set of pliers swinging on his belt like a sword of a middle-aged swordsman. He was climbing a mountain. His tractor, Cameron said. Shane will even sleep up in there when nap time comes. Just imagine what experience Shane has and what he is learning, and as he grows up, learns to appreciate. Is that how we grow farmers? Is that how Martin, my youngest son, has learned horses? Because as a baby, we placed him on ponies, and from there on, it never stopped. We need farmers, and someday Shane will be a farmer. But first, the little tyke must go to school. Oh, I feel for him. He reminds me of a little boy same age as Shane I knew in Australia who followed his dad the whole day on the farm. His name was Jan. There came the day Jan had to start school. It was a start in kindergarten. They talked it up and made Jan like school. The big day came, the very first day of school. But when Jan came home from school that first day, he had solved the problem. Later that evening, Jan proclaimed, school had been all right, but he was not going back. I heard that Shane, too, has been enrolled a few days ago in kindergarten. Weekends and holidays will hold a new meaning from now on. I know Cameron will at times look at the empty seat next to him as he mows or combines. He will miss his son, a future farmer. There's no doubt in my mind Shane will make his grandpa and grandma proud.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas. He's along our way every Wednesday right here. And finishing up today with this reminder about catching a replay of any given day's broadcast, should you miss it right here. You'll find them archived in podcast form at this website, agtoday.net. The broadcasts are posted there in reverse chronological order, easy to track down. Even more, if you'd care to have each day's broadcast automatically downloaded to your mobile device, the procedure for making that happen is spelled out right there as well. So check that out, agtoday.net. Otherwise, please be back with us right here tomorrow, won't you? Until then, Eric Atkinson bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.